Hey y'all, my name is Nika Primavera, and today I'm going to be discussing the ethical ramifications of nuclear power and how we as a nation are working on solving these issues. And while I'll be mentioning disasters like Chernobyl, Fukushima, and Kishtim, I won't be going over exactly what happened and what went wrong. So, before I begin, I'm going to give you a brief summary on how nuclear power works so you have a better understanding of what I'll be talking about. So, every power plant utilizes the nuclear reaction referred to as nuclear fission. And nuclear fission is basically the splitting of an atom, leaving behind smaller atoms and radiation. Most power plants tend to use the isotope uranium-235, also known as U-235, simply because it enters what's called a sustainable chain reaction. So when U-235 absorbs a loose neutron, it becomes easily unstable and breaks apart into smaller atoms like krypton and plutonium and such. But this creates a chain reaction, and it also releases more neutrons, continuing this chain reaction. Now, to get into the exciting process of the engineering created in the 1970s that has still yet to be updated, but was the cheapest and most accessible way to begin the idea of nuclear power. What they first do is they collect U-235 through different minings, and the U-235 are smashed into pellets, which are then smashed into very thin rods that are only a few centimeters wide. So what happens next is that these rods are normally clumped around control rods made out of boron, which is there to help absorb neutrons, any extra neutrons, so that they're able to control the nuclear fission much easier. Then we have alpha radiation, normally in the form of another smaller isotope, maybe like helium-4, is beamed into the control rods, igniting the fission. And the rods are placed in a large tank, usually filled with a coolant, also referred to as a moderator. This moderator is normally water. So the water is useful because it helps absorb and slow down some of these neutrons flying around. Unfortunately, this means the water is contaminated with a radiation. But when the water is heated up, instead of boiling it, it is pressurized and brought through a pump into a second tank. The second tank is meant to cool these coils so that the water can return back to the control rods and the uranium. So the second tank, when this water gets heated up, it creates a steam. The steam is then forced through to turn turbines, which ignites the generator, which creates electricity. When the steam, any steam that isn't accidentally released or lost, is then condensed back into water and pushed again into the second tank. So this leads me to my case study. The 3 Mile Island incident of 1979 is so far the worst US case recorded meltdown. So on a scale of 0 to 7, and 7 being Chernobyl scaled or Fukushima sized, this case was given a 5 due to the absent policies, the lack of preparedness, and the mechanical malfunctions. So the first malfunction was due to this pump right here that brought the condensed steam back into the second tank. Since these coils were unable to cool down in the second tank, this created a very intense pressure and heat that needed to be released. So with the lack of steam turning the turbines, of course, the turbine, generator, and electricity all stopped. And this valve needed to be manually released in order to relieve the pressure. And this is when the second technical error occurred. So when the pressure was finally stabilized, the controls claimed that this relief valve was closed again when in fact it was actually stuck. So the staff had no idea it was open since everything claimed it was closed. And because this was left open, the heated water contaminated with radiation was also being leaked out into the environment. Sadly, there was no water level indicator within this tank to show the staff that there was leaking coolant because it was always filled to the brim, so they just would assume it would stay filled. And now, without the coolant, the rods would heat up and cause the meltdown. This accident brought about a lot of questions to the people. What did this contamination do to them and their neighbors? What does low radiation do to one's health? And what does high radiation do to one's health? How high of radiation was leaked out into the public? This also brought about questions of what was going to happen to the local environment. The 3 Mile Island was, of course, on an island and surrounded by water, but what does a contamination leak do to the fish and marine mammals in the area? And this wasn't even the only concern. There is still uranium being mined. This radiation used to create power has to be mined somewhere. What is that doing to the locals over there, to the environment over there? And what happens to the plutonium and krypton waste that this power plant is producing? This also brought about a fear that this could be used as a weapon, as a terrorist weapon. In 1957, the Kishtim incident was revealed that the plant was a front for nuclear weapon development. So who knows how many more plants are hiding similar secrets. And of course, the people wouldn't have that knowledge. They wouldn't know. Of course, the government isn't going to tell the citizens that they're building bombs in their city. And finally, what does this mean for environmental justice? The Atomic Energy Commission, or the AEC, created these guidelines to place power plants in what they considered safe locations in the 1940s, but never took on the question of what this meant for social equity, nor did they disclose the full details to any of the locals on what that would mean for them. Before the Pennsylvania incident, the EPA had passed the Environmental Radiation Protection Standard for nuclear power in 1977. This act set a standard for an annual limit of radioactive material being released into the environment. And while the rules are strict, unfortunately, there has been no reviewing or revising of this policy since it's been issued, even after the 3 Mile Island accident. So the EPA also created the Ore Mining and Dressing Effluent Guidelines and Standards in 1975 to help regulate the water waste discharge from uranium mines. While the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or the NRC, has some control of the possession and transportation of uranium, the mining facilities are normally regulated by each state, which uses the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts to create a standard. This is good because each state is able to determine their own environmental impact and create guidelines around them. However, neither the state, the AEC, nor the NRC have claim over these mines. This means when the need for uranium ended in the 1980s, many mines were left abandoned without any cleanup. This may be the second most controversial issue surrounding nuclear power, next to Chernobyl-sized disasters. So when nuclear technology began, the issue of what to do with all this extra radioactive waste popped up pretty quickly. While radioactive waste helped make Spider-Man and the Ninja Turtles and the Daredevil, it didn't go well for normal people. The first idea was to just dump it in the ocean, like your classic Captain Planet villain. But in 1994, it finally became illegal to dump in the ocean. So the next thought was to dig a really deep hole and hide it there. And this is where we are today, with 5 big holes around America holding tons of waste. Some with a half-life of 24,000 years, and some with such an intense radioactive radiation, the half-life is about 14 years. The other issue is that we could easily reprocess this waste and extract the plutonium for energy to last hundreds of years, but we just haven't bothered researching the technology to create a reactor for it yet, since all nuclear advancements stopped in the 1970s. Now, onto the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, signed in 1968. This treaty was created to ban the proliferation of nuclear weapons. It wasn't long after the US bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki that other countries like the UK and Russia started researching and creating their own nuclear weapons. This was a great idea on paper, but during the Cold War, both sides continued to develop weapons in secret. And while this treaty was signed by the nuclear powers of the world at the time, this did not prevent other countries from discontinuing their own development. I mean, even today we see this as a recurring issue among countries. And finally, the hardest issue to solve yet, and the one rarely discussed in government, is what nuclear means to environmental justice. There's obviously no pros here, as how can you justify radioactively poisoning a human as okay? During the 1940s and the 1950s, there were many nuclear weapons testing going on above ground and in the water. Many civilians, especially those downwind, suffered greatly from radiation exposure. Thousands of Pacific Islanders were forced to leave their homes, which are still too contaminated to return to today. And many contaminated sites for the U.S. weapons testings leave locals, mostly containing minorities and indigenous groups, exposed to these same threats. Even uranium mining has caused major issues, especially for the indigenous people. Many sites were located on reservations, and from the 1940s to 1980s, the U.S. exploited the land, leaving behind mining waste that contaminated their food and water. And when the demand for uranium declined, these reservations were left with over 500 known contamination sites and no remediation. 50 years later, a study would show 27% of those tested would retain high levels of uranium in their urine. Even with all of this said, there's still hope for nuclear power with just a little R&D. Currently, China and the US are researching ways to utilize the element thorium. This new reactor cycle, in theory, can fully recycle actinide waste and would be far less toxic than uranium ore and be able to utilize the plutonium underground. Another positive creation from TerraPower, funded by Bill Gates, is the Traveling Wave Nuclear Reactor. This reactor utilizes a small amount of uranium, but is able to continue running on its waste, drastically reducing cost and refuse, while also creating a safer energy for workers, locals, and the environment. While it'll be centuries before we can clean up the decades worth of mess, there's a real chance of reviving nuclear power, making it more sustainable, and maybe replacing oil and natural gas for a cleaner future.